This morning, the passage we're dealing with is in John chapter 6. We're dealing with John chapter 6, verses 16 to 23 this morning. For connection, I'll maybe read a little more. This passage is about Christ's disciples. Maybe you remember from what he spoke about last week, Christ had performed that miracle of feeding 5,000 people. And he goes up into the mountain to pray, and he sends his disciples across the sea to the other side where he is planning on meeting them. And that's where we're left here in the passage. And we read here about a storm that takes place while the disciples are crossing that water. And so we can learn from this passage something about the storm itself, something about Christ and about God and how he dealt with that, but also about the disciples and how they dealt with that and how we should deal with that. So I'll maybe read from verse 15 for connection. So this is at the end of Christ's miracle. He says, of the people, he says, "So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea began to be stirred up because a strong wind was blowing. Then when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' So they were willing to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. The next day the crowd that stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other small boat there except one, and that Jesus had not entered with his disciples into the boat, but that his disciples had gone away alone. And there came other small boats from Tiberias near to the place where they ate the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the small boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus." We'll perhaps leave it there. So, our passage this morning about the storm that the disciples faced. It's about this difficult experience that they had when they were separated from Christ, and it tells us about Christ coming into that and how he rescued them from that situation. And of course, there's a lot of lessons we can take from this, because whilst we are not fishermen sat in literal storms, we can use this as a picture of experiences in our own lives. Thinking about what storms represent. Storms are something that's unstable. That's the idea. The fisherman is on his boat. If the disciples are on their boat in the storm and it's rocking, they're dizzy, they're disorientated, they're unstable. And that is caused by a loss of stability. Something stable in their life has been removed that is creating instability. And so these storms are really representing chaos in our lives. That's what we see here. And so that's something that we can apply to ourselves. We can take lessons about what to do when there is chaos and instability in our lives. And there's different ways in which that might affect us. The loss of stability, maybe that's caused by death, the death of a loved one, or maybe your own death is something you're facing with a terminal illness, or you lose your job or your house, a stable element of your life, or the breakdown of a relationship with family or with friends. These things can all lead to instability, and they can all lead to difficulty and chaos in life. And that's how these things feel. They feel like a storm. So first I want to speak to you about the storm that the disciples faced. The storm itself and things about the storm and characteristics of that storm. And then I want to speak to you about the God who's in control of the storm. And then about how we should respond to that in our own lives. So firstly, the storm they faced. The first thing I want to take about this storm is that they couldn't get out. They were stuck. I don't know if you've ever been in a boat or any other water sporting activity, whether you're kayaking or paddleboarding or surfing or whatever, but you find that you can very easily get stuck and lose control. I remember one time, we've got a river that flows around the beach here at Lossiemouth, and there was one time swimming in that river. I was swimming against the current, and it was a high tide, and there was lots of water powering through, and it was a strong current. And you find that even though I was swimming in one direction, I was completely stuck. I couldn't go in that direction. No matter how hard I swam, at best I was staying where I was, and if I started to faint or weaken in my efforts, I would only go backwards. The opposite of the direction I was trying to go. I was completely stuck. And that's what the disciples have here. They're stuck in the middle of this storm. It says to us they rowed about 3 or 4 miles. Now, the lake that they're rowing across here is about 8 miles wide in our passage here. And so really they're stuck bang in the middle. They're in the middle of this storm, completely immobilized and have no control. If you're swimming against waves, for example, not just currents, but waves, they push you back. And that prevents you from making progress in that same way again, completely stuck. And not only were they stuck in one place, but they couldn't see where they were going. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The waves in front of them, around them in the storm. I remember back when I was younger and I used to surf at Lossiemouth and didn't have that the strength that I needed to get out against the waves. What you would find is you would paddle and you would paddle trying to get out to sea, and the waves would push you, and they would push you closer and closer to shore, further from where you're trying to get to. But you also found that as you looked out, because you were lying against the water and these waves were rising up, you could no longer see where you were trying to get to. All you could see was the wave in front of you. And so that wave would come and you couldn't see your objective, and that wave would hit you and you would be unable to move, and all you would find once that wave went past you was that you're even further from the objective than you were in the first place. And so their view is obstructed. They're trying to look to where they're getting to on the boat, and yet all they can see around them is waves. And the other reason for that is, of course, that it's dark. Our passage tells us that it was in the evening. When the evening came, his disciples went down into the sea. And so in the middle of the night, it's pitch black, and all they can see is waves, and they're stuck in this one spot in the middle of a storm. And in that position, it's very easy to be captivated by the problem that you face, isn't it? When you can't get out of the problem, and you can't see out of the problem, and you can't see where it is that you want to be. You can't even comprehend what it is to be somewhere outside of that problem. It's very easy to be completely immersed in that. When your life is immersed in that problem, it's very easy for your mind and your thoughts to be captivated by that problem as well. And that's what the disciples faced here in this storm. Focused, fixated on the storm and on getting out of it. And yet, that fixation wasn't getting them anywhere. No matter how hard they tried to get themselves out of this storm, they couldn't do it. And the only thing that they could do was to look at their situation and, instead of focusing on the problem and what they were trying to do, accept that what they were doing wasn't working. But even if they accepted what they were doing wasn't working, they couldn't reach out for help. And that's another thing I want to think about with this storm. See, they were caught in the middle of it, but there was no way they could get help. They were isolated, bang in the middle, 3 or 4 miles away from anyone on the nearest land, completely isolated. And really 3 or 4 miles in ocean terms, if you think about the Atlantic Ocean, is not very much. And maybe they didn't feel very far in a physical sense from those on the shore, or from Christ, who was on the shore not far from them. But they were inaccessible. Maybe in the storms that you face in life, you've got people around you that are close to you physically and maybe close to you emotionally, that you have a strong connection with. And really, in a lot of senses, you feel near to those people, but you feel like they're inaccessible. Like you can't broach the problem that you face with them. Like you can't call for help. Because that's what the disciples had here as well. The strong wind was blowing. If they shouted for help, none would hear them. They were completely helpless. If somebody on the shore had spotted them in the middle of that storm and had seen them there, there's nothing they could do to help. They weren't in the storm with them. They didn't face that problem with the disciples. They were apart from it. The other disciples in the boat, they would have been aware of the situation. They were in the storm. They could relate to the experience. Peter could relate to John's experience. John could relate to Peter's experience, and so on. But there was nothing they could do to help each other. They were all stuck in this storm. And so the only one that could help them was Christ. And yet, there's nothing they could do to get nearer to Christ. We know that Christ is aware of them and Christ is near to them from our reading of the passage and knowing what happens after. That Christ knew the experience they were going through. But they didn't know that. Very much like what we were just saying, they were near to him, but he felt inaccessible. They didn't feel near to him, even though he was near to them. And there was nothing they could do to access him. They couldn't get to Christ. They couldn't get to where he was on that mountain. But our passage tells us, whilst they're helpless, they're not hopeless. Because Christ comes to them. And we see something about the God that's in control of their situation here. It says that they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat. Now, really, they were in a storm and Christ was in the land. It would have been far better for them to get to Christ than for Christ to go to them from their perspective. But they couldn't get out of the storm they were in. Christ went to them. And Christ got into the boat. He came into their problem. He experienced that with them. He could relate to their problem as much as the other disciples in the boat could relate to it. But they had to let him into the boat. It says in verse 21, it says they were willing to receive him into the boat. Elsewhere in our Bible, it describes Christ as the great physician or the great doctor. And I've been learning a lot about being a doctor recently. I've been on a placement in a GP practice, and part of that placement is that the doctor does home visits. And what you have there is a sick or an ill person who is unable to get to help. They need the help, and they know where the help is, but they're unable to access that help. They are unable to get to the doctor. And so what you find is the doctor then does a home visit. The doctor draws near to them. The doctor goes to the person's home to provide what they need in their sickness. But another component of that is when I and the doctor get up to the front door, the ill person or someone else in the house needs to let us in. You see, there's no point in a doctor going to somebody's house to deliver medication that they can't access if the person doesn't let the doctor into the house. Because then they don't get the help they need. So, yes, they're inaccessible, but the doctor has drawn near to them and made himself accessible. But they still need to let him in. And that's the same here. Christ has drawn near to the disciples. Christ has come into the storm with them. But they still need to let him into the boat. And Christ can relate to the storms in our lives. The Bible, again elsewhere, tells us, it talks of Christ as a high priest for us, one who speaks on our behalf. And it says that he is not unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. That is, that he is able to sympathize with our weaknesses, that he understands our weaknesses. And we can read through our Bible and we can see about storms in Christ's life and experiences that he went through. We can read about when his friend Lazarus died and the grief that brought to him. Or when his other friend Judas would betray him and the pain that caused. And when he He was in the Garden of Gethsemane about to be taken to the cross, and he would be faced with his own imminent death. We can read of grief and of storms in his life. And from that we can take assurance that he can get into that boat with us, that he does understand our weaknesses and our storms. And not only does he understand them, and not only can he come into the boat with us if we let him, but it also says immediately the boat was at the land which they were going. See, Christ was in control of that storm. And Christ is in control of our storms as well. Christ is in control of our difficulties in our lives. Now, this isn't to say that if you accept Christ and you take him into your life or into their boat, so to speak, that your storms will cease immediately. That's not always the case. Thinking back to that time in Christ's life when his friend Lazarus died, we read it further on that Christ then resurrects him, but that is days later. See, the storm didn't cease immediately for his friends who were grieving their loss of Lazarus. There was days there. Our storms don't cease immediately. They're a part of our life, but we can take comfort in knowing that Christ is in control of these things. And we can take comfort in that because we then know that since he is in control, that he will protect us. And it's okay to have natural responses to these things. You know, Christ says to the disciples, "It is I, do not be afraid." He's saying you don't need to fear the storm. You don't need to fear because I'm here. They were scared when they saw Christ. They saw him and they didn't know what was happening and they were fearful. But he says you don't need to fear. Christ is in control. And he doesn't ask them not to get wet or not to feel dizzy or not to be disorientated. And he doesn't ask them to not worry about the storm itself, but he says they don't need to be afraid. And so that's true of us when we face difficult things in life and storms in life. It's not that we need to reject these feelings of anxiety or fear or uncertainty, but it's that we can take comfort in knowing Christ who's in control of our storm, who's in control of our circumstances. And it does say, doesn't it? It says that the boat was at the land, that they do reach the land. And so yes, maybe our storm doesn't cease immediately like the disciples did here, but we know that Christ is in control and we know that one day we will reach the land, that eventually that storm will be behind us. So what should we do in light of this? There's a storm we may be facing in life. Whether that's right now or at some other point in your life, you will face storms, face difficulties, face loss, face chaos and instability, face experiences that you can't get out of, you feel stuck, you can't reach out for help. But you know that God's in control. Well, what do we do about that? How should the men respond? Well, we've spoken about taking Christ into our boat already. But there's a man in the Old Testament of our Bible. His name's Habakkuk. And he went through a storm in his life. He was looking around him at the country that he lived in. And he was a prominent figure in that country. And he was tasked by God, I guess, with caring for the people to a degree. And he looked around and he saw this foreign nation that were rising up and attacking neighboring countries and destroying people's lives. And he looked at that and he looked at the overarching, the geopolitical situation, if you like, and he said, this is coming for us. And that caused great instability in him. And so we have in our Bible, we have a section where he speaks to God about this. And he says, "How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you don't save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look at the wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. The law is ignored and justice is never upheld. The wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes out perverted. He says, these wicked men are surrounding the righteous, they're surrounding us. He's completely stuck in the problem, he's helpless. He says as well, towards the end of his prayer, he says, I heard my inward parts trembled. At the sound my lips quivered. Decay entered my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I must wait quietly for the day of distress. He's frightened. He's helpless and he's frightened. And he says, he talks about the things they put hope in for food, to eat, to survive. And he says, though the fig tree should not blossom and there be no fruit in the vines, he says, if the things we've prepared in the past and grown up produce nothing, he says, though the yield of the olive should fail and the fields produce no food, if those things that we plant now in the future grow up and give us nothing, he says, though the flock should be cut off from the fold and there be no cattle in the stalls, he says, if the animals that we have to eat just now disappear and we have nothing, if we have no hope in the past, in the present, or the future. He's helpless, he's frightened, and he's hopeless. But he says, I will exalt in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength. See, he's stuck in this problem. He's helpless. He's hopeless. He's not escaping the storm. The storm is there. The storm isn't changing. He's not being taken out of that. That is his life, and that is for him to face there. But he says he looks to Christ. He lets Christ into his boat. He takes Christ into his life, and he reminds himself of who God is, and he trusts in that. So from his experience there and how he deals with these storms, what should we take out? Well, there's three components I think we can gather to what we should do in these situations. In components to our response. First, we see his grief. He expresses to God the troubling that he faces, and his anxiety and his fears and his uncertainty and his concern and his worry and all these thoughts that are flooding through his head. He brings them to God. He has grief. But he also has belief, because he says, though I feel all these things and though I am absolutely terrified, I know the God that's in control. And he writes, here are the things I believe about God. Here are the things I know about your character, about the one who's in control. And he knows these two things. He feels this experience and this uncertainty and this fear. And he knows the steadfast love of God who's in control. And the third thing is that he brings them both to God. Because all of what we read there about his experience is his conversation with God, his prayer with God. He brings both. He says, this is how I feel and this is how worried I am, but I know you and I know who you are, and so I trust in you. So maybe you're facing a storm in your life right now. Maybe you're facing uncertainty or worry or grief of some kind, and things aren't changing for you. Well, I remind you just now that God's in control, and so you can take heart from that and be encouraged by that, and bring your difficulties to God. Let him in, and remember who he is, and bring that to him too. For he is not unable to sympathize with our weaknesses.